Hi, once again I'm Sydney. I am a servant of the Almighty God, in whose presence I believe we all exist every minute of our lives. And I am also the author of multiple books, the latest being the ESIS, Life's Logic Module. I want to start this whole new podcast thing that I believe will lead to, and its name of this podcast is going to be The Demise of Darwinism. Now, even though I am a believer in a creator, I'm not much into religions, okay? And the demise of Darwinism is not going to be based on some dogma, but it's going to be based on science and as we learn more about this world around us, that itself, and it has already started. It has already started, this demise of Darwinism. It's basically, hanging on by its fingertips now, and I'll show you how, and why it is. So this whole Darwinism thing that, the theory of evolution and all this Darwinism that followed, it really is the product of, Charles Darwin, who did some wonderful work. I admire the work of all researchers, everyone who seeks truth. But decisions are made based on the information that we have. So the information that's available at the current time, that basically is what goes into the decisions that come out of research. And so back in 1859, when Charles Darwin published his work, which became the foundation of this theory of evolution, based on this random mutation and based on natural selection, it was a great improvement over what was there before, this creation story of 7 days and all this stuff. But there were some serious limitations which have been exposed over the last 160, let's say less than 200 years. And so it has basically been worn out. And I'll go through, there are basically two main criteria that will basically invalidate all of this Darwinism that persists today. Now, just like when the earth was flat, or the earth was the center of the universe, it's going to be a while. And so, but with knowledge, with truth, it will eventually wear it out and it will have to be replaced. As a matter of fact, 10 years after Darwin published his work, on natural selection and the evolution of the original species by natural selection, and these assertions of random mutation and all of that stuff, there were two major discoveries that we can in retrospect look back and recognize, oh yeah, these things basically started invalidating a lot of, basically the basic concept, the basic foundation of what Charles Darwin asserted in his writings. So 1859, Charles Darwin comes up with his theory. 1869, we had, and I always mention this one, the great Russian Dmitri Mendeleev, and the revelations to him of the periodic table, which basically dictates or is responsible for just about everything around us, from what we eat, our housing, our dress, everything. But in that same year, we had Friedrich Miescher, a Swiss chemist, who isolated what he called back then the nuclein. The nuclein that he isolated 10 years after Darwin proposed his theory in 1869, he isolated nuclein, which today we know as DNA. So it's almost like 10 years after Darwin proposed his stuff, this nature was basically saying, hey, pump the brakes on that. Because what DNA showed us is that there were building blocks, regular, steady building blocks. Now, this whole concept of natural selection, if we hadn't found that building block to all of life, you would think that, yeah, all these different species, they are so different that maybe they have a different foundation. They all went off in their different ways and have their different molecular structures and all this type of stuff. But 10 years later, here is the discovery of nuclein, of DNA, which shows there is a building block, a regular building block to all of life. So all the physical forms are based, that's the blueprint, the encoding that says all the physical attributes will be encoded in this. So there's nothing random there. So all Darwin's work, okay, and again, it's wonderful to see human beings spend so much dedication doing research. But again, the findings are based on the knowledge of that time. All that he had was the physical things that he observed. Less than 200 years later, we have, from robotics, and now we're getting into AI, we find that for autonomy, they are basically, so what we find with with autonomy and robotics is that this likely applies to life anywhere in the universe, anywhere. So whenever we find those UFOs and the alien beings and all that stuff, they will have a lot in common with us. Because all life, as we know, must have that physical form, which can vary widely, right? We have all kinds of different physical forms. But it must also, this is what all life forms will share, is a sensory system. All life forms must, because that is basically, what I call the three components. There is that physical form, there is a sensory system, and then, as I've written in the ESIS Life Logic module, there will always be a logic module, something that controls. So let me give you an analogy that everyone can relate to. All these years that we've been driving cars, right? We were the sensory system and the logic module in the car. The car was the physical form. So think of our body like a vehicle. We have this, as in the car, we would look down the road, we would listen to the car, we would monitor everything, and then we would make the decisions. So in the time of Darwin, he observed just the physical form. Today we know that all life, for autonomy, so again, and this applies to life anywhere in the universe, that life will have a sensory system and there will be a logic module, something that controls. Because what the logic module does is, in fact, it monitors all the senses and then directs activities based on that input. So here is where Darwinism starts falling down. First, the essential sensory system. The more research we do currently, the more things are revealed to us. And so one of the findings recently is that turtles, fish, birds, possibly whales, they navigate, and it has been postulated that they navigate using magnetism. They can detect the magnetic field of the earth and they use that to navigate. Sounds logical. But here is the kicker and the Darwinism. In order to build a sensor, so in order to build a sensor for magnetism, you absolutely must understand what is magnetism. If you have no idea what is magnetism, you cannot build a sensor to it. It's the same with light. It is the same with sound. It is the same with chemical, all the sensory things that occur within our body depend on chemical sensors. Electrical sensors, similarly, you must know what electricity is, or you cannot build a sensor to it. So if we look at the magnetic sensors that these animals are supposed to have, something had to understand. And this is where I say there are three prerequisites to building a sensory system. And those three prerequisites must entail intelligence. So before you can build any sensory system, you must have intelligence. And again, I've done this many times. Let me iterate over these three prerequisites, without which you cannot have a sensory system. First of all, you must understand the stimuli. You must have a thorough understanding if it's magnetism or light, pressure, sound, taste. Taste and smell is even more complex because you have to understand the characteristics of all these different chemicals. So the first thing is you must have the intelligence to understand what the parameters, have a thorough understanding of those stimuli. The second thing is you must be able to find materials. So again, this requires intelligence. Not only do you have to understand what light is or what magnetism is, you have to be able to find materials and build a sensor. That sensor must respond to that stimuli in a predictable way. Because light is not just light or dark. We have colors, you have different intensities, you have that entire wavelength. Similarly, if you want to build a magnetic sensors, you have to understand that and the intensities and what's north and south. So you have to understand that. Then you have to find a material. So that takes intelligence. Understanding it, then finding the materials to build it. And the third part, again, so much intelligence. This is what I call like supreme intelligence, because now you have to wire that. The sensors, just as if we're driving a car, we see things, but because we see it, that does not change the direction of the car. We have to respond. So what we see, we respond with our hands and feet. So our ability to see, those optical sensors are wired into a system that enables us to respond. Similarly, that turtle that's trying to navigate, if there is an obstacle or some danger and they have to go around, it has, it can detect, so the sensors will detect, but it has to be wired to a system that responds to those sensors. We were that in a vehicle. Today, we have the vehicle will have all the sensors for the oil pressure, the temperature, the GPS and all of that stuff. And then there is that control module that monitors all these sensors and then responds. So it then directs, give it more gas, slow down, turn on the wipers, the lights, whatever. But the response system monitors The sensory system monitors that, and then it has to be wired to the system that can respond. So in every living creature, anywhere in the universe, you will have that sensory system, you will have that controlling logic. And unfortunately, in the 19th century, Darwin, that was way before his time. No, he was way before the recognition of all of this stuff. So he just looked at the physical things, and so now Darwinism, it persists, but it's strained because now they have to kind of fit all the intelligence and the sensory stuff into the natural selection. What has actually happened, so you will still hear occasionally natural selection, but let me give you an example of how this, why it does not apply. So take the concept of random, right? Let's say we have 2 handfuls of marbles, and we put 2 lines on the ground. We're standing on a floor, and we have a couple lines on the ground, and we say, we're going to just drop all these marbles. So we drop all the marbles. And the ones that go between those lines, those were naturally selected because for whatever reason they fit some criteria. They are perfect. So they go into that, they are naturally selected, they go between those lines. What do you notice? Well, we would have a lot of other marbles scattered around. As a matter of fact, there would be a lot more outside those lines than are within those lines, depending on how narrow those lines are. So more than likely you would have more outside those lines. So the concept of this random mutation and this natural selection would always create more what I would call unfit mutants. So in nature today, we would be seeing all these unfit mutants in every tree, every plant, every animal. We would be seeing that. We don't. What we see is what I call intelligent adaptation. We see intelligence. And all the naturalists, every one of them, they recognize this. This is why now we have terms like co-evolution, mutualism. And the concept there is that there is something, some environmental force that is having an effect on one, as an example, a plant, and somehow the animal that is probably feeding off that plant is affected, so it starts adapting to stay in sync with that. Even things like what you will hear like the arms race. That means that one is changing and the other one recognizes. That is all intelligent. That there is nothing random, and we don't see those unfit ones that didn't meet up in the arms race and just fell off. What we see is one changing, the other one matching. That's intelligence. So naturalists today, they all recognize that throughout our bodies. And I will, in this series, I will, be more detailed as I select certain animals and processes, but they all indicate intelligence. You look at within our bodies, the design, our respiratory system, the blood circulation, the arteries, the vein, and they will tell you these things, and this is just mind-blowing, and I did kind of address that the concept of logic, it seems to totally escape some of these folks. And it's all because they're trying to shoehorn, Darwinism into intelligence. Because I've seen things where they talk about, the eye, or the liver, or anything within us, that over time, the eye recognized it could be better, so it started changing. Does that really make sense? That the I starts changing based on what? Why is it changing? And it's all seeking to move towards some perfect form that we can observe today. Think about it. Just think about that. Why does something with no... Because again, the whole thing about Darwinism is that there is no intelligence. These things are just randomly occurring, spontaneously, randomly occurring, and they need to be naturally selected. But everything we observe, and everywhere in nature, there is intelligence, the functioning of our bodies. We can recognize that the behavior of every animal, it's programmed. You know, I select certain animals and go into that, but you will see that it is programming. Think about a bird, a turtle. The behavior is programmed because everything in that species behaves the same. And they would say, well, over time, and this over time, it's nonsense. Okay, I'll say it right now, it's nonsense. Over time would be the biggest cause of extinction. I'll give you an example. The first of anything, of any species that needs something, for instance, mammals. We know that mammals, they give their young milk. If the first mammal did not have perfect mammary glands developed, there would be no more mammals. But if you look at, and again, people look at the AI, you know, any one of these AI engines, and it says, well, you know, over time, you know, it was a sweat gland, and so what, they fed the baby sweat? For how many generations did this baby live on sweat? And if you think about all the intricacies, it's like throughout our bodies, we have all these chemicals that are you know, that and chemical sensors. And so they'll say over time, you know, and today they would say, well, it's because this chemical. Well, to have this chemical, you must have a chemical factory. We know what it takes to build a factory. So that it's not like the chemical just suddenly appears. There has someone, something built a chemical factory. So when we talk about dopamine and adrenaline and, you know, all these chemicals and that, you know, that occur throughout our bodies, you know, like I always, you know, remind people, even our emotions are the result of sensory information, and that triggers all kinds of stuff in our bodies. But you know, I've talked to some people in the medical field, and it says, well, no, this chemical causes this. And I said, well, did that chemical just suddenly appear? There has to be a factory to create that chemical, and the amount of chemical has to be regulated. It's not like it just starts pouring out this chemical, because I mean, that would be the end of that whatever that organism is, that probably would be the end of it. So we see factories, right? Chemical factories. We see chemical sensors, and they say, oh no, this is all random stuff. And you're like, think, how could that be random? That you have, you know, adrenaline, we have dopamine, we have all these endorphins, we have all these things that produce. That means we have factories. And then we have sensors that detect these things and respond to it. Where is that random? Where is the lack of intelligence in all of that? So this is what, you know, Darwinism is up against, and they're trying now to shoehorn it. Well, you know, it's as if random suddenly became intelligent, which cannot be. It cannot be, because it goes back to that fundamental question that I can't answer. I don't know if anyone can answer it without, you know, relying on dogmatic statements. We don't know where that intelligence came from. But we have to recognize, you know, we're talking about space travel, you know, going to Mars. When we get there, we put people on Mars, we'll go and explore. If we see geometric forms, we see circles and squares and, pyramidal structures and all, we absolutely associate that with intelligence. So anywhere on Earth we go, or anywhere in the universe, we associate geometric forms with intelligence. However, we look at the functioning of all life forms, and I touched on things like what I call the ham dilemma, hibernation, estivation, and metamorphosis. We see all these fantastic, and they all work. We see design, and then we say, no, that is the product of random stuff. So if you see lines on the ground, or we're looking for, just patterns in transmissions from, throughout space, and we say that's intelligent. But we look at a life form where we look at every single organism has a very specific tuned intelligence. Look at the functioning of bees, ants. We look at these animals that live together, and each one we can see it's programmed, and we say that's the product of random. That's the product of, and then we, again, as when we talk about the eye, we say the eye, recognized this, so the eye had an understanding of what light was and why the retina should move and the lens and all of it. Oh yeah, the eye decided that. And this is what's taught. So stop for a moment, think, could an eye just develop with, there is no impetus, nothing pushing it along, nothing requesting this, but the eye just decided that, the liver. You look at things like digestion. You put something in your mouth and all the different types of digestion. We see systematic things. As a matter of fact, Darwinism has just gone so crazy. You've heard, if you go into the AI engines, you will hear things like specialization, division of work, and collaboration. Think about that. Collaboration, specialization, division of work. These things came about naturally, with no intelligence, absolutely no intelligence. We can take 100 people. We are supposed to be so intelligent, and you just throw them in there and say, do something without, just throw them in there, say, build something. And somehow, with no intelligence, you would have collaboration, specialization, and division of work. And this is what we are told. This is all part of the Darwinism that we are subject to every day, because that they said, well, no. And again, it must revert to dogma when you get into it. Well, nature does. But even there, the very concept of nature implies intelligence, except it's totally invalid, because the concept is that whatever, unless this nature has this godlike ability to go to this plant and change it, then go to the bee and the flower, and nature is busy just changing everything. And is that how it works? Well, no, nature is not like that. Okay, so how does this nature, because that's the thing, it's easy to accept this dogma of Mother Nature. And you say, well, what's the mechanics of this Mother Nature? Does it go into, because when you change something, we're talking about changing the DNA. Not only is changing the DNA, but changing what I call the intrinsic intelligence, the behavior. Because plants behave. When a plant when it gets cold, the plant drops the leaves. The plant doesn't keep the leaves, and so that the water freezes and basically blows up the cells. It doesn't do that. You have specialized plants with specialized leaves that then they can they don't have to hibernate, but lots of plants hibernate. If you, and I use the word loosely, hurt a plant, it knows to heal itself. So you see intelligence. This is more widely depicted, and everyone can understand this, I think every naturalist now has accepted this. There is a relationship, often symbiotic, between plants and animals. Plants use animals, so they say, hey, I'll give you something. I need you to disperse my seed. I need you to get young plants in different places, so I will give you something. This is that relationship between bees and flowers, bees and butterflies and flowers. And the more we research, the more intelligent we see, even between these species. This defies that whole concept of the random and the natural selection, because we're seeing it between species, that co-evolution, that mutualism. Okay, and that flies directly in the face of this Darwinism that they're trying to drag it along and fit all these things into natural selection. But it absolutely makes no sense, because everything that we see has embedded intelligence, and the whole system seems intelligently designed. When you look at an ecosystem, across the entire ecosystem, we see organisms that fit every niche. It's like, when something dies, immediately, whether it's vultures or flies, whatever, you see that reusability, you see that beautiful design in every ecosystem. And so somehow we are, people dogmatically say, well, that's just nature. And it's okay, so nature is going and, put the sensory system on that. Now, how did the sensory system come about? Because the fly has it, and so it knows it has a job. It's programmed to do certain things. Well, no, you can't use it, and that is that dichotomy that we are seeing, we are experiencing with Darwinism, where it has to be removed. And the greatest, the research done by the naturalists, and they are the ones who are showing us there is intelligence everywhere. As a matter of fact, it has become almost fashionable. If you do, not even research like I do, one of the things I've found, it's fashionable now to say, well, Darwin predicted this. And I was like, what? Darwin predicted? And people say, yeah, Darwin. I'm like, hold up. You're talking about random and prediction? How does random that somehow falls into natural selection go with predicting? You see, it's like the weather. Many years ago we would have thought that the weather was random. Now we know there are rules that govern it. So it's not alive as we know it, but there are rules. They can look at the temperature, the pressure, the ocean, look at all these things and say, this will logically result, and with pretty good accuracy. So for Darwin to postulate that this is just this natural selection and this random stuff, but I can predict. No, prediction goes with regular logical intelligence. Then we can predict, like if we take numbers,